Welcome to Module 20. In Module 20, kind of in the same way as in the previous module, we looked at an ancillary concept of Intelligent Advisor. We looked at test cases. Here we're going to look at how we approach another challenge related to deploying in the right conditions. Test cases help us make sure that our policies are correct, but what happens when we need to start deploying in multiple languages? It's another challenge of deploying an interview or deploying in a wider environment. So this chapter is going to look briefly at the kind of functionality that you will need to include in your project when you're working with multiple languages. Very simply put, we'll look at one after another the features that are available, and there are a couple of areas, even in your rules, where you might want to leverage a function to be able to understand more about under what condition your interview is running. More of that in due course. In Intelligent Advisor, before we begin, we already know this, but we'll talk about it and we'll see it in the demo in just a moment. You can write rules in another language, or you can even display the entire user interface of policy modeling in one of the supported languages. And there are functions dedicated to this, and also built-in features to help you make the most of Excel, for example, to be able to rapidly create multiple languages. So here's the first common sense point is, remember that when you create a new project, as you can see on the right here, you get to choose the language that it's written in. So the language that is written in, of course, implies that your target audience, maybe one of the languages they speak is French. If you yourself are French, you could choose to have the entire interface of Oracle Policy Modeling in French. The two are unrelated. You could be writing rules in Arabic, but looking at Oracle Policy Modeling in English. But the point I'm trying to make is that you can choose to configure those according to your needs. When you want to see the application itself in French, there is a there's a switch to tell it to display the user interface in a certain language. Now let's move to more practical things. Let's assume that you're underway, you're building your project, and now you realize that you're going to have to deploy to multiple languages. It can either be the first thing that you do or the last thing that you do, but go to the Interview tab, go to the Styles button, and in the header area, remember to ask to display the Change Language icon. If you don't, the user won't know how to switch between the languages that you're offering. If you switch this option on, the user will see a globe icon, and they can click on the icon and choose one of your prepared languages. So the first thing you want to do is make sure the end user knows that you have multiple languages. The second thing you'll want to do is to create a translation file, or maybe more than one. You'll create one for each of the languages that you intend to implement. Let's take a look at that in more detail. I'm going to switch over to the application. I'm going to enable the language icon, and then I'm going to create a translation file. So I've come back to the Garage project that we used a couple of times, and I'm going to go first of all to the Interview tab, and I'm going to go to the Styles button, and I'm going to go to the header area. I'm going to say Show the header, and let the user change language. Optionally, I can change the icon by providing another image, but I don't really care for now. I'll say OK. So I'm going to debug my work so far. And you'll notice at the moment that I don't have a globe in spite of being able to ask for it. And I only have one language. If you have the globe, or if you don't have the globe, consider switching back to the header again and making sure that you have this option that says hide when embedded. What does that mean? It means that when you're in the debugger, for example, you're unlikely to see everything that you need. So because it's embedded inside another window. So I'll debug again. I still can't see the globe because I only have one language at the moment. So now let's add a language. I'm going to go back to my Project tab. I'm going to go to the Language tab. I'm going to go to Translations, and I'll click Add. And for the sake of demonstration, let's say that I'm going to use French France. Okay. After a brief delay, an Excel translation file will appear down at the bottom of my window. So just to remind you, the original project was written in English and the region was the United Kingdom, and now I've added a translation file for French. I'm going to double click that file so we can take a look at it. Once again, you'll find that it's a different kind of Excel spreadsheet compared to the typical rule files we saw in earlier projects. You'll notice that there are a variety of tabs: variables, relationships, screens, events, messages, and so on. And I'm sure you've probably worked out what's going to happen now. My job, or the job of whoever is providing the translation, is to go through each of these and translate them. I want you to notice three things. One, you have the original text as a reference point. You don't need to touch that column. It's there to remind you what the original version was. Two, you'll notice that you have unformatted positive, negative, question, and uncertain. There are many different ways to express a value in Intelligent Advisor. You could say the customer is happy, the customer is content, the customer is not content, is the customer content, it is uncertain whether the customer is content, and so on. So be ready to provide not one translation, but multiple translations for each attribute. And the third thing I want you to notice is that everything has an exclamation mark in front of it. Exclamation mark is how we say, okay, this is not translated yet. So if I type in le client est content, and I'll copy that, save a bit of time. I'll only do one. And we'll finish this off with never mind if there's spelling mistakes, I got it done as fast as I could. So I've removed the exclamation marks from each of those elements, and I've completed one line. For those of you who are wondering what the concept of unformatted is, you may remember that number attributes can be formatted or unformatted. That's why you have an unformatted column there as well. I've filled them all in for the purposes of my example, and I've saved my work. And I'll return to Oracle Policy Modeling. And I want you to notice that I have 158 errors. That sounds bad, doesn't it? It means that there's 158 items that still haven't been translated, or rather that haven't been modified in any way. So I'll say one last one. There we go. Save that. With a bit of luck, you'll notice we've come down to 157. So it's not about errors, it's essentially about untranslated material. You'll notice also warnings and missing. Depending on how far you go down this route, if you are involved in complex projects that change often, you might find you get warnings, typically when you have something that's been translated twice by accident in the same file. We'll talk about that in a minute. And missing, when you run an update on everything, it'll tell you if you're missing some words that are simply not in your Excel file. Those two particularly happen when you've made massive changes to your project, so your original Excel file needs to be updated. You'll notice here that there's an Update All button, which is a way, for example, if I go and create a new attribute, I'll call this the test attribute, and I go back to my, you'll notice it says missing one. It's saying there's something that you've added to the project that is missing from my spreadsheet. So if I was to update all, it would go back into that spreadsheet and add it into the spreadsheet, and hopefully no more, there we go, I'd have no more missing. Warning is used exclusively when you have accidentally duplicated a translation. Okay, so let's return to our internationalization slide. So you've got it that working through that translation file is key to all of the success of this process. Of course, It's an Excel file. So you can give that Excel file to somebody else who's not an intelligent advisor person and maybe speaks the language and say, could you just translate this for me? And they can edit it all. You only have to spend a few moments explaining to them how to remove the exclamation mark and not to touch the original content column, but they could be working on it. As I mentioned previously, the errors and warnings and missing will help you guide you through the process of making sure you've eliminated all things that are untranslated. You can use the Update All button if you've added attributes like I showed you. Notice the last point, Update All doesn't delete unused translations. So if you've deleted an attribute and Update All, it won't delete it from the spreadsheet. You'd have to do that manually. If you have duplicate translations, you can expect to find this in your translation file. Warnings will appear to tell you that this has been forgotten or this has been duplicated. This text already has a translation. So it follows through pretty well if you have been making large-scale updates to your file. Now, and this is where I'm going to cross my fingers, we should be able to, in our debugger, take advantage of the second language. So I'll go to the debugger. I want you to notice two things. I almost breathed a sigh of relief. Number one, there's a globe, and now I'm able to choose between the two translations that I provided. Or I can simply use the drop-down built into the debugger to switch. Now, of course, me having only translated one small part of this application, I'd have to hunt round these screens to find where was the item that I changed. I can't even remember. I think it was the... Voilà, est-ce que le client est content? So those parts that have been translated are showing up in French and the rest of it's still in English because I haven't done my work yet. What's really interesting about this is you'll notice that the infrastructure, so the standard elements, have already been translated. There are many things in the application that you don't have to translate. If I return to my Excel file and open it up again, you might have noticed briefly when I was going through this earlier on that there were lots of other tabs, and those tabs actually contained, if I go far enough down the list, standard things like the months of the year, the days of the week, standard messages. So there's a lot of standardized stuff in the Messages tab that is pre-translated for you, assuming you are working with one of the translated languages. If you were to pick a language that is not currently supported by Oracle Intelligent Advisor in terms of the language of writing your rules, you would have to do this yourself. But because I chose French, and because French is already one of those languages, I get this pre-translated. Now, so far so good. What else do we need to be aware of when we're working with international projects where we have multiple languages? When you set your project to language English, region English, United Kingdom, or France, French, you're actually also setting a time zone. So if you choose English United Kingdom, you'll choose UTC Standard Time, which means that when you're working with multiple language interviews, you need to be maybe thinking about, okay, when someone's choosing this date and this time, what's the time zone associated with it? This can be particularly true when you're receiving data from an external source. So what that means is you will need to look in the debugger to make sure that you have the right time zone. The time zone is actually associated with the region and can be viewed as part of the formatting for a region. So each region has its own predefined settings. For example, if you choose France French, it assumes that the separator for thousands is a dot and the decimal point is a comma. Whereas if you choose English United Kingdom, it's the reverse. It is possible to view all that formatting information in the Styles dialog in formatting. It's unusual to want to change it, but it is possible to change it. For example, you might temporarily change some of the formats to include the time zone, so that when you're looking at the debugger and you're reviewing for example, the date and time of the interview, that you are clear as to what it means. Does it mean 8:57 GMT, 8:57 Alaska Standard Time? So that's something you could do temporarily, is using the dialog, oops, beg your pardon, I'll get there in the end, is add ZZZZ at the end of the formatting. So the formatting here in the styles dialog, so that you can temporarily display the time zone to understand how the time zone is relating to the language and the choice of the user. Clearly, if we need to have multiple languages for our user interface, we will need to maybe have multiple languages for our PDF files. You may remember in a previous module we created a PDF file with Intelligent Advisor data in it. If you have more than one language, the chances are you will need to copy the existing form, and as I showed you in the previous chapter, place it in a folder in the same location as the original one, only the folder name will be FRFR or PTBR, whatever your four-letter code for your language region is. If you don't, you'll get an error message like this to tell you, it's weird, you've told me it's in French, but we're missing the translated form for French. To make that go away, copy your form into a new folder. One final point is it's sometimes useful within a project to be able to understand, well, what is the current location? What is the current locale? And you can do that using the current locale function. So the current locale function allows you to retrieve the four-letter code for the active session. So if a user has switched to French, you would see the relevant code, or if they switch back to English, United Kingdom, you would see the relevant code. So maybe you have visibility logic based on this, that if they've chosen French, you hide the map of Britain and you show the map of France. I'm just giving you an example. So you can use it in show if, hide if, and so on. A few other things that are worthwhile considering is that when working with multiple languages, if you decide to implement a project in a language other than English, be aware that not all languages behave the same way. So if I chose to write my Word documents in French, I would need to be aware of certain things in relation to contractions. In French, sometimes we contract words because they don't sound right together and we put an apostrophe, or we, for example, we change how we say words based on the gender of a word. And so you have a table, which is la table, and you have a car, which is la voiture, but you have the client, who is le client ou la cliente. So we need to think about gender and how we handle gender. We handle gender differently in French than we do in English. In English, gender is all about the gender of the human being. So it's his car or her car. The car itself doesn't have a gender. It's based on the owner of the car. Whereas in French, it's the opposite. The car is always feminine. So it's une voiture, la voiture. So it's ma voiture. Even though I'm a man, it's ma voiture. So it doesn't work quite the same way. So some of the substitution functionality won't work the same way as you'd expect. Similarly, genders won't work the same way. Contractions you'll need to think about. Be careful of interview layouts, especially in languages, for example, like German, where we often have compound words that become very, very long. So in the English version or the French version, it looked like this, but in the German version, it looks like this. So be careful that your interview layout fits all your possible languages. Final note, it is possible to even go so far as to create a custom language. Perhaps there's a variant of an existing language. Let's say that you're speaking French, but you're in a region of Switzerland that has its own subset of vocabulary, its own argot. So you want to create a customized version of French. You can do that, but it is a task requiring you to build a custom language, provide custom syntax, and there are some significant limitations about what you can do with this. I think I'd summarize it as this, is every supported language and custom languages, they all have different challenges, whether it be how they handle contractions, how they handle genders, how they handle certain circumstances, certain words. You know, for example, you look at something like the Slavic languages where they don't have a the, they're all handled differently. So you need to read up before you start. So what do I want to say in closure? I want to say in closure really that we're ready for internationalization. Interviews in Intelligent Advisor are incredibly easy to implement in multiple languages. They necessarily have a level of effort because you have to translate stuff. We are not yet at the point where we can call upon an external translation service and get it to translate on the fly. Although if you're interested, there is an example of that on my website. It's far more likely that you are going to want to have the content translated and implement it properly as translation files, and then let the user decide which is their favorite language. That's it.